Srividya, what were the poems you liked as a child and as an adult?
I loved the nursery rhymes that I was learning in school. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, Mary had a little lamb. We also learned a lot of Hindi rhymes because I studied in a government school. So those were the things that I first actually was drawn to. As an adult, anything by Vikram Seth or Mary Oliver or Arundhati Subramaniam, uh, these are the poems or these are the poets that I'm actually drawn to. So very different, but I think I'm drawn to the rhyme scheme as well. And I see a lot of rhyme scheme in Vikram Seth's writing. So I think that's where a lot of my love for his work and the fact that he uses language in such almost miraculous ways, that's where that love for his work comes from. Yeah.
What does it take to follow your instincts? And how do poets find motivation to keep going? We may have learned poetry at school, but they were invariably obtuse and hard to understand until we reached an age when a poem captured something prose didn't. And then you wanted to know more. Srividya Sivakumar finished her PhD in English literature. She has taught innumerable students over a career spanning 2 decades. She writes about the small but significant nuances of language in addition to her calling, poetry. She has published three collections of poems: The Heart is an Attic, The Blue Note, and most recently, The Soundtrack of My Life, Side B. In this episode, we will speak about how she began, what inspires and moves her to write, and what it takes to pursue poetry as a career. My name is Venugopal. I head Ideascape, a company into advertising, branding, and design. And every week, we speak to people who have gone through different career journeys. And today, I'm very happy to have Srividya join us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for this very kind invitation, Venu. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Wonderful. So, this love for languages has always been there.
Absolutely, always. Because I started reading when I was very young. I was 5 or 6 when I was given my first book, and I started writing when I was 7 or 8. Very embarrassing poetry that I look at now and I think, oh gosh. But I think all of us start like that. We start writing terrible stuff.
Yeah.
I remember watching a James Bond movie and I wrote a story that I thought was very good called The Man with the Golden Gun. And all sorts of, so, and I still have those diaries. So whenever I feel very proud of myself, I remind myself that, listen, you also wrote utter rubbish like that. But when you're a kid, you don't really care. And there was a kind of like a kick in getting to know these words and then trying to figure out how to make these words your own. And writing was the easiest way to do it. And I think adults were a lot more kind then. So when I would go and show them this rubbish, they would be so encouraging. Like, oh, how beautifully you write. Go write more. You feel even more emboldened, even though you don't have any idea that your work is so bad. So yes, I've always been fond of words. In fact, if you gave me a choice to teach anything in language, I would prefer to teach vocabulary because there's something really beautiful about discovering new words and knowing that there is a word to describe even the smallest of things. It's like I compare it to a video game, right? Because you never know where the treasure is and where the magic is happening. You have to hit your head against every brick. So it's like finding a treasure. And your mind is blown because you said, oh, there's a word for this. So yeah, I've always been drawn to words, always.
So, home, you got a lot of encouragement, but school is
Yeah.
normally not a place where you find good teachers. So, you were lucky enough to find good teachers as well?
Strangely, I don't remember my teachers except for my primary school teachers. We had Dorothy Daniel ma'am, we had Barbara John ma'am, and they were teachers who really were lovely. and I remember them teaching us Kuchu and his glasses, which is all part of the textbook. And I still remember Kuchu and his glasses, though it's been centuries since I left school. But not in no. I wish I could say that I had fantastic teachers in school. I'm sure they were really good at whatever they did. But in terms of encouraging somebody who was reading a lot more than the average kid was, I don't really recall. No. But I did have a lot of conversations and arguments with my English teachers. So there was always room for that, trying to convince them why I think an answer works and so on. So in that way, they were encouraging. I had teachers outside. I had parents who would talk about language, or a sister who would buy me books. And so it wasn't necessarily the school teacher who helped me with the vocabulary and with the love for language. It was other people around me as well.
And do you find that this is true, that some people take to reading naturally and others can't be persuaded no matter how hard you try? Do you think that that is a.
In yes, sadly, because having taught for more than 25 years now, when I initially started teaching, my aim was to ensure that every child became a reader in the class. And now I feel even if I can get two or three kids to start reading, I consider it the greatest victory of that classroom. I think just like anything, Venu, for instance, no matter how much people tried to persuade me, I never had a head for mathematics. Maths and I live on separate planets. So even if you brought the best teacher and said, Vidya, look, he's going to teach you or she's going to teach you, I would just not get it. Or sports. My poor father gifted me a tennis racket. He thought I would have some sporting abilities. Nothing at all. I am as clumsy as they come. And I have tried my hand at many, many games. I think I'm okay at Uno and Pictionary, but please don't ask me
It's around
to.
words again.
And, yeah, yes, exactly. So please don't ask me to play tennis but my sister was very much into sports. She was a state level badminton player and into javelin and shot put. So my father was also extremely physically fit. He used to win table tennis tournaments well into his 60s. So I think he tried very hard to get me to get into yoga and running, and then he realized, okay, this girl, there are some battles even I have to give up on. So I think we are drawn to things that we feel strongly about. For some people, it's sports. For some people, it's books. For some people, it is being very outdoorsy. For some people, it's cooking. It really depends on what your leaning is and what you feel comfortable with at the end of the day. It shouldn't torture you. So for me, that comfortable space was and is words and books. Yeah.
Yeah. You write these lovely posts on LinkedIn where you manage to zoom into one particular use of language, which I think is the nuance that is not just definition, it's also the way the language is used. And
Right.
to a large extent, I think you've succeeded in getting a fair amount of interest and fans around that particular set of posts that you do. So, poetry, what's the point at which you thought you had enough to publish a book, or how did it come about?
Thank you, first of all, for saying that about my LinkedIn posts. I started writing on LinkedIn when I didn't have an audience at all. I think I had fewer than 500 followers if we are keeping count. So whenever I feel like the LinkedIn algorithm is not being helpful, I remind myself that I started writing because I saw LinkedIn, and I still see LinkedIn as an extension to my classroom, right? So the important thing is to write. It doesn't matter whether people are reading or not. You write because you want to. That's who I essentially am as a teacher. Coming back to your question on the poetry collection, with the first book I published about 12 years ago was The Blue Note. And I remember sitting with that manuscript for 2 years before I gathered up the courage to send it to the Writers' Workshop, a Kolkata based publisher. And Writers' Workshop is like a prestige project. Prestige because the biggest names of Indian poetry have been published by Writers' Workshop. And it's a Writers' Workshop book because it's cloth bound and it's got this beautiful gold calligraphy. And it's just a beautiful book to have. With The Heart is an Attic, Same thing. I was writing poetry. I try to collect them. I keep a diary and a pen and I try to write down. So I typically type out poems on my phone and then I try to put them into the diaries because I still like to write. That also, I think, took about a few years before I decided that I had enough and published it. The soundtrack of my life, side B, honestly came about because on Instagram, I was on Instagram then, there is a beautiful page called the Alipur Post. And every year she does a poetry prompt, uh, um, 30 prompts over the month. And a friend and I took up this thing of writing poems every day. And had he not told me, let's write poetry every day, this book would not have come about. It came about because I started writing poetry, and most of the poems that I wrote during the Alipur Post event became the book that we know. So I start writing, and then I come to a stage where I feel, okay, I think I've written enough, and then I go and publish.
Okay. It's such a wonderful title because I think I looked at the other books you've written, and yes, they have their resonance, but Soundtrack of My Life, side B, is a very cassette kind of reference
Yeah,
because in today's world,
yeah,
everything has become is abstracted out and there is no sort of side B to anything. Whereas any of us who've been through the cassette years, we understand
yeah.
exactly what side B means.
Mm,
So I
mm,
think that's it's almost as if, and we have these analogies about a certain early stage in life and then middle, and then you're looking at, okay, what are the ways in which you change? And
yeah.
I think that this captures that brilliantly. There's a lovely poem which is about uh, you know uh, the flowers that you grew up with. Can you tell us
Yes.
about how that came about?
I
Because
think
we
you're
all grew
talking
up with
about
William Wordsworth's daffodils.
exactly my point. I think you're talking about why would I want daffodils when I can have
Yes,
sunflowers? The first poem in that collection.
yes, 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 yes.
Of late, I've been feeling that a lot of my teaching experience has to translate into the poetry that I write. And I see
Okay,
this poem as a companion poem in many ways to a poem in my previous collection, which is Pamuk Plays the Palanguri. I wrote about a poem where when you're an Indian or a Tamilian writing in English, people ask you all sorts of questions about why you don't write in your mother tongue, not realizing that language is language and it's a means to communicate. And this is one of my theories about why we don't read enough poetry, and that is because we are reading things we don't automatically connect with. For instance, I did read Wordsworth and daffodils and snowy evenings and so on, but I have never seen a daffodil in my life. And I witnessed snow only, 6, 8 years ago when I went to Kashmir. Because when you're growing up in the south, the snow is one extremely, almost like a fictitious idea. So I felt, and so if you ask me what are the flowers I connect to the hibiscus or the jasmine or the tuberose or the frangipani or one of those more humble, for want of a different word. So I feel if I can write, so I can only write poetry that feels familiar to me. I can't write about some exotic thing that I have no resonance with at all. And that's how that poem came about. It came about because I feel we live in a world that seems to adore this concept of the Western world. And I realize it's ironical because we're speaking in English and I write in English and I teach English. But I see it more as a tool to communicate and earn a living rather than something to be arrogant about. But in India, we seem to think that if you can speak English, you're automatically better than people who cannot, which is a misnomer or a misconception that I'm trying very hard to get rid of.
okay. That comes through very clearly. Have you tried looking at seeing if children are more welcoming of poetry when they see Indian themes? And have you actually tested that out in class? Why show, reading out some of the poems you've written and seeing if they resonate better?
The Daffodils poem is in the in house textbook of the previous school that I worked in. We have a really lovely English teacher there who created her own textbook of poetry. So it's done along with the regular texts that the children study. And one of the poems is "Why Would I Want Daffodils?" And so it's tucked away in the textbook. And I don't tell children that there's a poem of mine, but when they discover it, they come running and they say, we read your poem, and they analyze it with me. They're able to understand so much of the nuance when I'm talking about eating, in a picnic or during a moonlit night, or I'm talking about how my grandmother's fingers were fragrant with, I remember her making that jasmine garland for the gods or for the women in the family. I think they're able to
Right.
see it better. Plus, if when I do poetry events with them or I do poetry classes with them, I tell them to write what they know. So if we are doing a shape poem event or we're doing acrostic poetry, I tell them write it like write about things that you know. You don't have to. So now I've made it a policy that if they're writing a story, they cannot use any foreign names. They have to use Indian names. The more Indian, the better. Otherwise, they come up with the most vague, they'll do Spanish names and all that, but they won't do Indian names. Like, no, I'll minus your marks. So they're very particular. Okay, Srividya is going to. So they stick to. I definitely think we have a better chance because they are so much more open as children than we are as adults. So that is the time really when we can actually. So why do the rhymes from our childhood still stick in our minds? Because that was an age where we absorbed everything like sponges. So imagine if we can do it with other poetry as well. We can talk about something simple. I don't think Rabindranath Tagore is complicated because a child can see the surface meaning of that. Why not? So yeah, I definitely feel if we could create more Indian themes and Indian writing, and a lot of people are doing it. We know people who write poetry in Hindi and poetry in Tamil and so on. And a lot of the new age schools are teaching not just English poetry, but they're also teaching poetry in the regional languages. So yeah, I think there is some hope for us after all.
Yeah, there's this whole thing about useful skills, must have skills, and okay to have skills. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, poetry is not seen as something which is within quotes useful or kept in a,
Yeah,
even though it defines us as people in terms of what we write, it defines the deepest portions of our psyche because it goes to
yeah,
places that your normal writing doesn't. Because in a poem, you can have just
correct.
8 lines, 10 lines, and still have
Right.
some amazing thoughts
Yeah.
conveyed. But what has the experience of teaching children been? What has your, because in a sense, that is your career. You teach and you write, and
Yes.
that one
Yes.
feeds on the other. So,
Hmm.
what is it that has inspired and worked both ways for you?
I have actually been a college level teacher for 20 plus years. I taught a little bit in regular colleges. I remember teaching Shakespeare for MA students and general English. And it's only been in the last 3, 4 years that I have actually started teaching school children. And when you're teaching an elite course like CAT and you teach GRE and GMAT, when your colleagues meet you, for them it is like a step down, as though teaching in school is not as prestigious as teaching an exam like the common admission test. And I always tell them that you're missing something essential, which is that with children, the feedback is immediate. They like your class, they'll
Yes.
tell you. They don't like your class, they'll tell you. Whereas
Right.
with CAT students, I have received emails 5, 6 years after they've left my classroom saying, I started reading because of you, or I got into a B school because of you, or these are my future plans because you said something in class. So if you're the kind of person who works off someone's feedback and you want to know whether something has worked or not, there's nothing better than school children. Secondly, I feel like I'm doing something vital. Creating a love for reading, I'm creating a love for language, I'm telling them that they are better than what their levels are. So I have a student in the school that I teach and who's got a flair for language. I can see it in the way he writes, but has somehow convinced himself, maybe because it's the lazy thing to do, to say he's not very good at it. So in all the feedback that I write for his exams and tests, I always tell him that he has the ability to do a lot more. But he's just lazy. Somewhere in the middle of, I can see in the middle of the story, he's kind of lost steam. So the story goes downhill. It started with a lot of promise, but then what happened? Like, no, but no one told me this. So I'm telling you, if children will remember that you taught them a class 10, 20 years down the line, or it helps them look at the world. Because I don't see reading and literature as a subject. I see it as a life skill. Knowing the language, writing, reading, they're all life skills. You're never going to be able to convince me and say, these are all useless skills. They'll never be that. What is the harm in reading more? What is the harm in knowing more than one language? If you can speak Hindi, for example, you can manage pretty much in the north of our country. In the south itself, we speak so many different languages, right? How do I limit myself to just Tamil? When I moved to Vijayawada, I had to learn Telugu, and I learned it very joyously. Once you know a language, you can learn most of the South Indian languages I've seen. So I feel with
Right.
school children, the experience has been this immediate feedback. Yeah. And
Okay.
the downside of it is they can be very noisy. So that is that is something to get used to. But that's about it. Yeah, that's about
Great. So I'm speaking to Srividya Sivakumar, and she spoke of how her entire journey in poetry started with the love for reading and writing starting as early as age 7 and 8. She, of course, thinks they were very childish to begin with, the story about James Bond. But she found that an encouraging environment at home and the praise that was bestowed on her was something that helped her understand and acquire a love for languages, which has remained lifelong. She also says that she was never oriented towards sports, it was always words. And I guess that's part of the reason why one tends to like doing certain things in life. So, in a career, if you accept that these are your strengths, and the others are not necessarily weaknesses, they're simply things that you're not prepared to put enough effort, and you don't have the curiosity as much as other people do. Some people lead a very physical, they love the physical aspect of it, which is what she says her father always regrets, that in spite of all the efforts that he made to ensure that she followed sports, that was something that she never took to. As a teacher, I think she's done a great deal in terms of being able to introduce children to the love for poetry and language, because that's another thing that teachers have a great effect on you, even if you're not able to recall precisely why you like a certain subject or you like a certain uh, thing. That's the reason why, where it begins, and then the interest kind of builds from there. In the next segment, we're going to talk of what is it that is involved in publishing poetry, because this is a career show. So whether, don't look at poetry as something that you're going to be earning a lot of money from, but what does it mean to immerse yourself in it, and what are the ways in which you go about getting published? Those are the things that we're going to be focusing on in a little more detail. So Shiv, they are all. So that first step, you mentioned briefly that you started out when you had a certain set of poems, and then you approached the company in Calcutta. But what did that involve? You sent the manuscript. It's basically the same thing that you send out, and then they come back to you and then tell you that this is how we'll go ahead. What happens?
it. Yeah. So typically, that's how it works. You send your manuscript and you wait with bated breath. And if they like your work, they say they like it, and you do a lot of to and fro in terms of editing and so on. But that was my experience with the first book. What happened with the second book was a lot more detailed. What I learned with the first book was you need to be very careful how you order your poetry, because if you
Okay.
don't if you're not very careful in how you order your poetry, you're not going to give your reader the best experience. For instance, in the first
Can
book, I
you
think
expand that? Yeah.
yeah, so in
Can
the
you
first book
expand on that
my
a little more? What does order mean?
so with the third, I think I'll start with the third book, The Soundtrack of My Life.
Okay.
So the Red River aesthetic, or the Red River thought, is that your poetry has to be segmented. You need to have themes for every single segment. And for someone like me, it's very difficult because I thought I only write love poetry, right? So this was actually a great exercise because I made an Excel sheet. Excel and I also don't live on the same planet, but I made friends with it for the book. So I made an Excel sheet. I wrote down themes for every single one of the poems. And then I realized that, okay, Not bad, Srividya. You've got a few more themes in the third book that you did not have in the second book. So I realized that I could divide the poetry into love poetry where it's a success, love poetry where it's not, poetry which has to do with my domestic life, parents, teaching, and so on. Poetry that has to do with language itself, language per se, and what it means for me to be an English teacher who writes poetry. So that division was actually very important. And with the third book, the editing was much more intense. We did a series of to and fro because every time a correction is made and the entire manuscript comes back to you, I want to go through the manuscript again. So I met a young poet who's getting his book published next year with Red River in Bangalore. And he asked me this advice, and I told him, every time the manuscript comes back, you go through it again. Don't just focus on that one poem which you offered as a correction, right? Go through it again because till the book gets published, you will constantly want to correct. Finally, my publisher said, listen, if it's grammatically incorrect or a spelling error, then point it out. Don't try and change the words that you've used right now because you may think a word works better now, but it's never going to end. You'll rewrite the entire manuscript. So I finally stopped. So the simplest way to describe the publishing process is you collect your poetry, you decide what works, what doesn't, you send it out to your publisher, and you hope that your publisher will have the good sense to tell you what poetry works. With my previous book also, The Heart is an Attic, Hava Call was my publisher, the editor told me this poem does not work. So I was able to remove a few of the poems. To kill your darlings is not easy at all because you feel like it's a personal insult when someone says they don't want to include that poem, but it's very, very important to do it because then you have a richer book when seen as a whole rather than just, okay, this poem works, but this poem does not. I think if you tried the bigger names, if you tried, say, HarperCollins and so on, the wait is much longer. I'm still waiting to hear back from them for the third book, which has already been published. So the wait is much longer. And they won't tell you whether they like your work or not.
Yeah. It's a waiting game anyway, whether you're publishing prose or poetry. Unless, of course, you get into self-publishing. Did you look at Amazon as one way of exploring it, or do you not believe that is the way to go?
So the first book that I wrote, The Blue Note, it is very insulting, but I get it. Because some of the books that have come out in self-publishing have not been great. I get that. And when I started writing, 12 years ago, self-publishing was kind of frowned upon. Like newspapers would not do a review of your book if it was self-publishing. Today, I see that that's not the case. There are a lot of books that are being self-published that are getting reviewed, which is great news because not everybody has the ability or the process of going through trying to figure it out. All because with poetry, I feel there is something to be said about holding a book of poems as opposed to prose and non-fiction. I'm constantly downloading books on my Kindle, but with poetry, I try not to download books on the Kindle, though I know it's handier. I want the feel of a book, especially if it's poetry. I want to be able to touch it. So I never considered that as an option at all.
Okay. And this might be a little odd, but do you think that there is a class of poetry that does better commercially? Is there a way that you think that, or would it destroy the essence of poetry if you were to look at what works in a commercial sense for poetry?
There definitely is a class of poetry that seems to be doing better. If you went to Instagram and you looked at the Insta poets, you would realize that what I've seen is that they do a combination of a little drawing and a few lines. And the lines are very basic. We're not looking at vocabulary or language at all here. And they have been extremely successful. Some of the biggest influencers on Instagram are poets as well. So there is a certain formula that works. But the question is whether you want to follow that formula. The reason to write poetry is because I want to speak my truth. I want to do it in words that appeal to me. And it's a bonus if a reader also understands it. But the poem is essentially written for an audience of one, which is me. Just like a LinkedIn post is written for an audience of one, which is me. So when I put it out there and people respond to it, I become most excited because I didn't think people would be interested in usage. Similarly with poetry also, there definitely is a formula and a lot of people seem to have hit upon it. And now because I've come back to Instagram, I was away from Instagram for 2 very happy years. But because of this book, my publisher told me come back. So I've come back to Instagram and all this poetry is hitting me in the face. There is definitely a formula, but would I call that poetry? Would I call it my kind of poetry? Probably not.
Okay. But do you think that that is also a kind of gateway to people publishing more stuff or poetry because it has the entry point which is different, and maybe over time that gets into something which is a little more deeper? Or do you think that because it's social media, it'll always remain on the surface? It won't really,
Right.
you know, make any inroads. Is that how
No,
you
that's actually not. No, I don't see social media as surface level at all. On Instagram, people are talking about extremely serious themes. It just depends on who you want to. You have to curate your news feed just like you need to do on LinkedIn also. So I don't think social media is overwhelmingly surface level. Yes, I understand where you come from when you say surface level, and I get where you're going with it, but it completely depends on what you want to read and what you want to see. You're right about it being a gateway. For a traditional poet like me, publishing a book is my way of going. I will publish on Instagram, but only as an afterthought. That's not my main thing to do. I want to be able to publish a book. But a lot of the younger audience or even older people are saying, you know what, we don't need to do a book. If ultimately you want your work to be read by others, why not just harness social media's presence? And they've been extremely successful. What social media has done, which a traditional poet like me had to perhaps struggle with, is it's removed gatekeeping. There's a lot of gatekeeping in pretty much any creative space. And social
right?
media is saying, listen, don't go and knock on doors and so on. If they want, they'll come to you. Why don't you just use me? So that platform has made it so democratic that everybody who wants to publish can publish. The upside of it is there are some fantastic voices getting heard. The downside of it is there are some not so great voices that are getting published as well. But it depends
Yeah.
on what you are drawn to. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the unusual bit that we used to think that gatekeepers were unnecessary, and it always allowed you to sort of, you had to kowtow to the establishment, or be within a certain kind of frame in order to get known and recognized. And now the problem is flipped, where you're able to, anyone can publish, but then discovery has become a much bigger problem. It's almost as
It
if a
has.
lot more people can write, but
Yeah.
it's much, much harder to aggregate an audience. So
You're
it's as if the
absolutely right
gates
about
and the
this. Yeah.
audience is fragmented.
You're very, very right. That's such a good observation. I do think gatekeeping is unnecessary because if the gatekeeping doesn't come from an
Yeah,
honest place, if I'm gatekeeping
yeah,
because I want my friend to be published and you're fantastic, but you miss out, he misses out or she misses out on an opportunity, we know that gatekeeping is false. So to that extent, gatekeeping does not make sense. I know a lot of people believe that gatekeeping keeps the standard of that creative world alive. I don't believe that. I think
yeah,
if the revolutionary poets and so on, were scared of gatekeeping, we would never have had great work. It has
right.
made it difficult to be recognized simply because so many books are getting published, so many poems are getting published, and we never really know what makes a poem click with an audience. Like one of the poems
Right.
in the soundtrack of my life, which is dedicated to my mother, it's called You Are a Pigment of My Imagination. I had a great time writing it because it encapsulates, and if you've met my mother, I have a friend who's met my mother just recently, and she said, this is exactly like your mother is. It's a huge hit with people. People love that poem. People ask me to read it all the time. I went to Bangalore. I read it there also. I read it in Chennai. I read it in in the Uti library. So I don't when I wrote the poem, I didn't think it would appeal so much because my mother is a very unique kind of a mother, if I may say so myself. She may be almost iconoclastic compared to the regular mothers one meets, but it's a huge thing. Or even LinkedIn. I remember,
Yeah.
was it 2023? Your first post for that year was which post of yours had gone viral. And I remember you had tagged me on that post, but I had nothing that had gone viral. Just, I think,
Okay.
2 weeks ago, I wrote a random post about the Oxford comma. It took me fewer than 5 minutes to type out that entire post. 2 lakh
Yeah.
something views. I'm like, what happened? I spent so much time and effort carefully curating a post,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
crickets, the same people who come to my post faithfully to say something nice, come. It just dies. It just sinks like a stone in
Right.
water. So we
Right.
really
Right.
don't. We were discussing this. We don't know what causes virality, and more importantly, virality means sales. I don't think it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. And it's crazy that you try and attempt it, and there are formulas, but at the end of the day,
Yeah.
it seems like a overdoing it, because then that seems to be the only objective. You're not trying to do anything which is what you're interested in. If you
Yes.
had
Yes.
that particular poem, would you like to read it out right now? The one you've written about
Which
your
one?
mother?
The mother one? Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I'd be happy to. I don't
Describe.
think this poem does any justice to her, though she's very kicked to be in the book. She tells everybody. She tells him I wrote a book, but more importantly, please turn to page 78. That poem is about me. So this one's called
Okay.
"You Are a Pigment of My Imagination." Dearest Ma, my earliest memories of you are loud music and your dancing and singing. I love loud music, can sing and try to dance. I'm often asked what my family values are, and I say a sense of humor in adversity. Where do you think I learnt that from, Ma? The afternoon when I was born was a cold one. The military hospital had a handsome gynecologist, and you told me it helped you a lot. From cooking experiments, cabbage transformed into rasmalai, to zany fashion sense, including bright orange sleeveless t shirts to greet stiff upper lip nephews, I've learned that laughter is therapy. I laughed when a day before emergency surgery you asked, "Are you sure?" I love all your deliberate malapropisms, your present continuous tense, and juvenile delicacy. How draining for you is a combination of drizzling and raining, and how you say loitering and poitering. Ah, Ma, but I know you wonder sometimes why I am the way I am. When you struggled to drape a sari on me, I cried at the hideousness that looked back at me. Did you wonder, Ma, how could someone you created be so unkind? When I told you about what I had done, you looked at me askance. How could the child created by many degrees be this stupid? When you learnt of my illness, you cried because you thought it was in my genes. Some of what I write and say worries you, I know, Ma, but haven't you taught me that choices are mine to make? People say I look like Dad, maybe, yes, true, but I hope as much as I am him, I am just as much you. Yeah.
Wow. I can fully understand why he believes that you
Okay.
know, that it brings out an aspect of, and none of it is the conventional mother-daughter bond.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about, the affection is there, but it's under so many other aspects of what you have defined as the ways in which, and that I think is the wonderful part of what you do, because being able to see something that is obvious only after it's pointed out, it's almost as if people say, yeah, you've captured it, but then it's only when you bring it out. And there is something else which is common, which is mimicry, where people then seem to get the essence of how the
True.
person speaks, or a
Yeah.
certain bent
Yeah.
of mind, or a certain nuance in how the language is expressed. And it's almost as if they get it down to exactly what that
Yeah.
person is about. So if friends who've met your mother have told you that you've managed to capture that, I think it reflects that beautifully, which is where this whole thing is about. Okay, so
True.
let me just make the announcements here. So Srividya in the last segment has spoken about what it took to get published, what were her ideas, and how There is, of course, a very uh, regular process of sending it to a potential a publishing house to check if it has potential, and how she goes back and forth on it. Like a woman's work is never done, the poem is never done. You're always looking at seeing ways in which it can be improved. So there's a point at which you have to stop and then hand it over. She spoke of how social media has brought about a change in what is so called popular poetry. And that is almost like a new form because it allows you to express things in a way that gets across to people much faster. The feedback is much faster. And I think she mentioned that earlier about her teaching as well, that teaching younger students is so much more energizing because the feedback is immediate. Whereas if you were teaching older children, you do know that you have made an impact because they could write to you after 6 7 years and then say that I read because of what you've done. And uh, I know that that love for language came because of the way you taught me. And we spoke in detail about that one poem she wrote, writes about her mother and capturing that essence. And I think it stands out again, not just because you capture the essence, but you capture it in a way that is not been done before or not been done conventionally when you see it. The moment you hear that poem, then you realize that it also captures a sense of the culture. It also captures a sense of what has changed in the relationship between mother and daughter. And those, I think, are the really strong points. In the final segment, we will focus on what Srividya thinks poets today, if they're interested, should look at doing, and what does it take to write poetry apart from the talent. So anyone who has dreams of writing poetry, what would you want to tell them?
I would tell them to write without thinking about publishing. Today I spoke to the mother of a 13-year-old girl who's been writing poetry since she was 7 or 8 and has already published a collection or two collections. And she wants to meet me. She's known to a student of mine. She wants to meet me to give this girl some advice. And
Okay.
I asked, does your daughter read? And she doesn't read. So I said, how do you build on vocabulary and ideas if you're not reading at all? So if you want to be a poet, if you want to, I don't think people set out to want to be a poet. You may want to be a copywriter, you may want to be a content creator, you may want to be an editor. But poetry is something you either you write it or you don't, at least in my loosey goosey way of looking at poetry. In order to be a poet of some repute, I think you also should be a really vast reader. You need to read whatever you get your hands on. You should not be, you should not focus on, I want to read only this. Read a lot and then figure out what you want to read. And when I say read a lot, read everything. Read non-fiction, read fiction, read movie reviews, read cricket commentary that comes in the newspaper, read a lot of poetry, and then figure out where your heart lies. Initially you may find that you're imitating the way the person you admire writes, but then after some time you will find your own voice, and then that voice will go through a process where you strengthen it over and over again. But if you want to be a poet, you have to write without filters. I think because, like I said, I write for an audience of one, I tend to write very openly or very frankly. My poetry is considered very frank because I'm a woman who writes about love poetry and about sensual poetry. I write because I don't think anyone is going to read it. So part of sitting with a manuscript is also in my head saying, do you really want people to read what you've just written? Do you want people to know you've used this kind of language? So once I convince myself that, yeah, and it's great actually, the older I get, the less I care about what people think. So I tell students, you think your 20s are freeing, wait till you hit your 30s and your 40s, you'll be freer than you can imagine. I don't really care. You have a problem with the poem, just don't read it. Don't come to me and tell me it made you uncomfortable or you whatever it is. So write without filters, read a lot, and don't think about publishing. Publishing is not the end goal of writing poetry.
So what was the young girl's reaction, the one whom you said, when she said she doesn't read? and you told her to read, did she think that was necessary, or in her mind, do you think she was still saying, "Yeah, but I write poetry without reading, so why should I?" What do you think
So
is the? Um,
I actually spoke to the mother of this young girl. I'll meet the young girl around Diwali. And I told the mother, because she's asking me for advice, I don't really know what she wants from me. I think because I've published poetry, she hopes that I can kind of help her and guide her. But I've also started becoming very possessive about my time. Also, I realize that we live in a world where people feel your expertise should be offered free of cost. And they're shocked
yes,
and horrified when you say, I'd like, I'm a professional editor, I charge so much, you never hear from them thereafter. So I want to understand what she wants. If it's just advice and we're meeting over a cup of coffee, I'm good to tell her what I've learned. But I realize that everyone's experience is different. But I feel that in
yeah,
terms of common experiences, you really need to be a reader. She used to read the newspaper, she said. Okay, used to when? She's 13. So when was she reading the paper and has stopped now? I'm curious to know that. And when I meet this young girl, I'd like to look at her work. I've still not learned the art of saying your work needs improvement without being rude about it. Or if I can categorically give feedback, then I can do that. But that kind of feedback takes a lot of time and effort. So I want to get a sense of her writing. Maybe she's incredibly fantastic, but I want to know. And then I'd like to give her a little more advice. But definitely my advice is going to be read more. And I hope she takes
sometimes,
it in the right spirit.
right, absolutely. I had a guest on the show who had ADHD. He couldn't. He had a reading issue, but he turned out to be a master quizzer. So I asked him, "How did you
Wow.
manage to soak up all that information?" So he said his way of soaking up the information was to go for every single quiz show in town. And he would soak in the questions that were asked at each one of these shows. So he would listen, he would watch. At that point, YouTube
Fantastic.
was not part of it. So I also think that we used to have an oral tradition, we have a written, and so for some people, reading is much easier. For some
Yeah,
people, listening is much easier because uh, in a conversation with the publisher, he said that audio is really going to take off. So maybe for some people, they listen to books or they listen to stuff rather than read because to them
absolutely.
the written word doesn't seem to appeal, or
Yeah.
some people prefer to watch it as movement on a screen so that then it comes
Mm,
across. So I think even our
true.
definition of what we have, and I think the people who were not interested in books were in some way handicapped because it's as if the world was telling them, look at what you're missing out, and they weren't options for them. But today, I think there is a great deal of additional inputs that they can get. It'll be interesting to see if that
You are right.
results in poetry, which, or prose, which is very unusual or which has a different dimension, because that is the other thing. And this is the part about Instagram, which I found, which I never looked at it that way, that young people communicate just through photographs. They don't need to write the words. They send a photograph, and the other person seems to know exactly what this whole thing is about. So it's
True.
nonverbal. We talk of nonverbal communication, but is it actually happening? And am I, my generation especially, I can't think of that as something that actually works, because if I was to just send a photograph to a friend, I'll say, okay, where is the explanation?
What is
Whereas
the story? Yeah.
today's, yeah, and I wouldn't even know if that is summing things up of what is there in the mind. So I'm also wondering whether at some point the written word and what it's moving towards is something that we are also figuring out, because poetry is at some point an abstraction. It's not just the words alone. There are a whole lot of things between which you are trying to bring out, and you're saying in a way which is not, which the prose may not have done. Or I'm saying each of these are different in their own forms. But I'm also trying to see what are the ways in which poetry can be used in ways that it is not currently being done. Is it only for language? Is it a better way to teach something else to children?
Okay, so I belong to a generation where if you gave me an image and you gave me a caption, I'm reading the caption first. I'm drawn to
Right.
words. And when I
Right.
was a teacher, I used to believe that if you don't read, then where are you getting your information from? It took me a while to understand that reading is not the only way to get information from. I remember speaking to C.K. Kumaravel, the gentleman who runs Naturals and that chain of Green Trends, that chain of salons, and he said when you listen to music, the music director is making money. He was speaking at a symposium. The music director is making a lot of money. You're listening to him on your commute, right? But what I do is when I have to travel from my house to, he lives in Chennai, no? And he says, I listen to ebooks. And I can say I have read those books, but I've actually not read them. I've heard them. And I've got so much information. And I was thinking also that, yeah, as long as I'm getting the information, how does it matter what the source is? Sometimes I may not be able to afford a book, right? Or I may not be able to read it. I was mildly dyslexic as a child. I was not able to read as well as I should have. So I don't think I was reading with a little bit of difficulty. So I think what happens with an audiobook is we do take into consideration more people who want to read a book but are unable to. The young generation now, I wish they would strike a balance between images and language. That would be, that's a very English, that's a teacher way of looking at things, because it's a very simple thing to do. I know they spend a lot of time kind of composing that image and things like that, but why can't we do a combination of both? Why can't we also talk about words? To answer your question about what poetry teaches, definitely more than a love for the language. If you look at all the revolution, or if you look at the revolts, or you look at the protests and so on that are happening around the world, people are also chanting slogans, and those slogans have that sticky power. They stay in your memory. And for me, any word that sticks is poetry. It's a lyric, it's a song. And so poetry is actually at the forefront of all. This is what I mentioned in that third TEDx talk of mine also, that poetry is at the forefront of all these revolutions. Poetry is saying, listen, you may ignore us, but you can't ignore our words, and our words are powerful. So I find poetry to be very useful when we want to explain, especially to a child, the world around us. And if we look at a revolutionary poet from a different part of the world, and we say these were their struggles, children are curious. They actually go and they do their research, and then they come back and they say, okay, this is what I learned from that poem. So we just need to guide them towards a particular poem. But for that, we also need to read a lot as adults. We need to read a lot more so that we can tell the child, look, this is a poet and this is what I want you to focus on. Like, I remember reading Varsan Shire. She's the young poet laureate of the UK. She's got a poem called Home, which is about the refugee crisis. And it's like a slap in the face to anybody who believes that refugees should not be refugees. And it's a very moving poem for anyone who believes or who feels for the plight of people who are basically without a country. Very, very, very powerful writing. And she's a young woman. She was in her 20s, I think, or even younger when she wrote it. So when you tell a college student that somebody in your age has written this poem, there's an immediate connect. There's also a lovely reverse poem called I Am Ugly. When you read it from the top to the bottom, it seems to say that the poet is filled with self-loathing and believes that he is ugly or she is ugly. But then when you read it from the bottom to the top, the meaning is completely
Wow.
contradictory. And when I do it in school for the children, they get such a kick out of it. Like, we want to write a reverse poem. Now write it. And they talk about serious themes. Children are dealing with things like colorism. They're dealing with fat shaming. These are kids in the seventh. When I didn't even know that such words existed when I was a kid, but children at a younger age are dealing with things we dealt with as adults or didn't deal with at all. Poetry is a way to kind of hold out that beacon of light and say, listen, there's someone who's gone through the same experience. Would you like to read what they have to say? And if it ends on a positive note, they take comfort from that. So, I think when we say poetry as a language or poetry for literature studies, we're kind of reducing its many, many uses to just one aspect. And it's an important aspect. Definitely for a literature student like me, poetry gave me a lot. But with that poem, I'm able to do a lot more as well. I'm able to get to a student who's dealing with something serious, or I'm able to discover that a student writes well. One of my students, her story is in an anthology that is getting published from across the country. I have nothing to do with the anthology, but the fact that she reads a lot and likes poetry also is definitely, I think, a factor that contributed to it.
And I think we always believed that an abundance of information would work to our advantage. But I'm
Hmm.
wondering if, in with all the search engines and all the, ways in which AI can be used to zoom in on exactly what we're looking for, I'm wondering if abundance is creating the wrong, set of another set of problems, which is almost as difficult to deal with in terms
Yes,
of what you just
yeah,
mentioned. So I'm just coming at it from the other thing, because we hunted, we looked, because there weren't enough.
yeah,
Now that's available to
yes,
us, we lost out that
yeah,
urge to really figure out what is there, and we're making do with what was easily available rather than put in the effort. Because we always assumed
that's it.
that if there was enough available, uh, people would naturally grow more involved
Hmm.
in, which I'm not sure is happening.
I think what I think what has happened now is because we have easy access to information, we've not gone looking at it. It's like if
Yes.
people live in Agra, they go and visit the Taj only when their friends come from out of town. They don't visit it at all. Someone's made an actual trek and a trip to come and see the Taj. They're like, yeah, it's right there in my backyard. I don't need to go see it
Yeah, yeah,
because we have information. So I think this is what you're absolutely right. As a kid, the only jam that was available in the Air Force canteen was Kisan mixed fruit jam, and I ate mixed fruit jam for all my childhood and most quite a bit of my adulthood. When I grew up, I told my sister, I am not going to eat this wretched mixed fruit jam again. I rebel against the mixed fruit jam. I go to the jam aisle. There's such fantastic jams, and I go and look for a small bottle of Kisan mixed fruit jam, and I come back with it because in my mind I capture a bit of my childhood that way. But also, it's a very familiar, comforting ultra. I think Kisan mixed fruit jam is just eating sugar. That's it. That's not. There's nothing else in it. Now
yeah,
there's one
yeah,
Kisan fruit mixed fruit squash as well, as though jam was
yeah,
not enough. So I think we our abundance of choice means that we are eternally confused, and we aren't putting in the hard work required to find information relevant to us. If Wikipedia is our source of all information, an editable repository of information, we have a problem on our hands. So definitely use the internet. But so what I tell kids is, can you look for other information also? Can you go to Encyclopedia Britannica? Can you go to a college website where they talk a lot more eruditely about things? So you have to kind of guide
yeah.
them. That's yeah,
That's the only way possible. Thank you,
yeah.
Srividya. It's been wonderful talking to
Pleasure.
you, and I
It's
think we
been lovely
covered
talking to you
much.
too.
Thank you very much for coming on the show, and I hope
Pleasure,
everybody
pleasure.
will understand that this is not a conventional career, but if it's always a choice in life. And
Yes, it
all the
is.
best to people who want to pursue
Thank
it.
you. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me, Venu. I love talking to you. Thanks a lot. Good luck. Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.